At Roofscapes, we often use the term the climate realignment of building, realigning a building from the climate for which it was built to the climate that it will have to endure. For us, it was like, what is the most important problem and site of intervention that has had the least innovation? And I think that's really what we tried to tackle.
Today on Most Modern, we are joined by Olivier Faber, a French architect and educator with MITx. At Roofscapes, an architectural practice that he co-founded, Olivier and his team are working to cool Paris and other cities by adapting an overlooked but ubiquitous architectural element, the roof. Navigating various design, political, and scientific challenges, Roofscapes adapts those surfaces that protect us from the elements but also absorb and retain heat into green, active spaces that cool and enliven cities.
Most modern.
Why is it important for us to explore alternative forms of architecture practice?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one that came to us in the summer of 2018 and 2019, Paris, with my co-founders Tim and Ethan, because these summers were the two hottest heat waves in Europe history, back to back. And we realized that after having finished our undergrad in architecture and having worked in a few practices, we realized that a lot of the work that was happening was focusing on new build. For various really good reasons. But we thought that there might be a lack of innovation and inquiry in the architecture world about renovation and climate adaptation. And I think that's partly because we, as architects, are oftentimes brought up on projects in a very reactive manner. Like, I think the pipeline that comes to architects comes from demands of clients and word of mouth and sometimes competitions and commissions. But oftentimes for like the lay architect, like we are coming out of school, it would just come from whatever a client would want us to do, and then we'd have to answer that. I think given the climate crisis and given the role that both the construction industry plays, but also the capacity for architecture to help buildings and cities and infrastructure adapt, I think it was important for us to feel that we had a way of practice that was less reactive and that was, I think, pushing something out there that felt a little bit more curated than just kind of hoping that our next client would be someone that would ask us to do something that we would feel climatically and socially.
Can you help us and maybe the listener understand the difference between like a new build and a renovation from a climate perspective? Like, why is there a difference? Why do you guys feel that it's important to maybe consider rebuilds in a more prominent light?
There are many aspects, but the way that I would think about it are two different aspects. One is that it would, in the energy and the resources that we deploy in new buildings, so either tearing down a building and rebuilding it anew, or just taking all the materials on a new piece of land required to build new buildings, it's incredibly costly in terms of resources and carbons and all kind of things. So there is already a movement that we are a part of, but we are sitting on the shoulders of giants here that is trying to see the value in already existing buildings, to try and say, let's maybe adapt what is already here, not to have to re-spend all the carbon and the resources to rebuild entire buildings. That's, I think one aspect, which is just an embodied carbon and energy question. And then the other one comes with the fact that climates used to be relatively stable on Earth for a while, I think at least at human scale. And right now, extremely rapidly, we're seeing warm climates shifting away from the equator every year and seeping into lands that are more used to be tempered and are more and more suffering from summer heat waves and droughts. And what that means for cities who are geographically staying put in the same place is that all the buildings of existing cities have been built to react to climates that are very different from the ones for which they are currently experiencing and that they will be experiencing in the future. So to answer the second aspect of this question, we used to be thinking of renovation as something that we needed to do maybe once every 50 years or once every 100 years on a building, which would mean that it would go at a rate of roughly 1% of an entire city would be revamped per year, which means it takes 100 years for the full cycle to happen and the whole built stock to actually be refurbished or retrofitted. To prevent all kind of dramatic effects in cities, it's important to accelerate the pace of renovation and prepare buildings for climate change and adapt them. As we say at Roofscapes, we often use the term the climate realignment of building, realigning a building from the climate for which it was built to the climate that it will have to endure.
This is a great time to go into Roofscape. How did this environment motivate you guys to create Roofscape, and what is different about Roofscape than the traditional practice?
I think the way that we think that is different. It might be more conventional than we think, but the way that we tried to do it is we as architects have been employed in a variety of firms to do sometime really great work and sometime really questionable work, not in terms of the architectural quality, but in terms of like who pays for it, what are the forces that it's pressuring cities with, and what is the climate impact of a building and the accessibility of the houses that are being built and stuff like this. So what we wanted to do as Roofscapes is to try and find a project, a product, something that we could sell with our architectural skills that we would make sure would serve at least an agenda that we considered was one that we could feel comfortable with. And so rather than I think branding out of school our skills as architect, like we could do so many things because architect could deliver so many things. We're only doing this extremely niche thing, but then making sure that the funnels of client that we would get would only enter through here. And I think we tried to do that for a variety of reasons, but mostly to make sure that we would use our time as architects on the planet to do things that we thought were helping causes that we directly want to address.
So what is the product? Like, how does this product drive your mission?
So what we tried to do with not always success, but at least what we tried to do is to make sure that we can develop projects as architects that are replicable. I think part of the great frustration we sometimes had working in the industry is that because architects are in some form of way artists of their own, and they have to say something smart and beautiful and site specific and era specific at each and every of these projects that they do throughout their career. A lot of time it feels that we are reinventing the wheel when it shouldn't necessarily be. I think in a world with a relatively stable climate and affordable housing, that's great. That's a wonderful thing to have on Earth because it's really, really important. But I think given the kind of forces that our societies are going through, it was important for us to find a way of practice where we could develop interventions that are replicable, that we could do one, prove they work, and then we can kind of package them. And we can do them on all form of building typologies, and then maybe other folks start doing the same thing as we do, and then it kind of creates a movement in of itself. And I think we did that very specifically on the question of the climate adaptation of envelopes in buildings in dense center.
So let's talk about the adaptation. Like, what does it physically look like? Can you describe the before and after for our listeners?
Basically, what we define as our site of intervention as architects at Roofscapes is not working in the buildings. We barely do any interior work, and we do no new builds, but we only do basically the retrofitting of the building envelope. So the roof and the facades, and we focus on finding ways to shade them, make them accessible, and vegetalize them. Those are the three things that we try to fold into all our projects for reason that we would be happy to develop. But basically the first project that we did, the first way that we try to embody this intervention thesis as architect, which is like retrofitting the envelope of existing buildings, was to work on the zinc roof of Paris. Paris is a very homogeneous city with a landscape of roof, which gave the name of our studio, Roofscapes, that is very specific because it's built out of a metal that is zinc. And this metal is kind of a byproduct of different industries. So in some way, it's also a great way to use this thing. And it's been done for centuries now in different cities in France, but particularly in Paris. One of the problems with this material is that it heats up a lot, which was not a problem for the moment that they decided to build the entire city for it, but now we are seeing it every year. And so what we thought of doing was to try and find a solution to shade these roofs without replacing them.
So what happens when the zinc heats up? What happens to the building?
So what happens when the zinc heats up is that it can go up to, and I'm going to mess up my Fahrenheit, but it's going to go up to like 70, 75, 80 degrees Celsius, the zinc itself. And what this happens when the zinc is bombarded with solar radiation in the summer is that it both radiates this heat inside the building. So for people who live in the last floor in Paris, or the last floors, and then it also radiates it out, which increases a phenomenon which is a little jargony, but is really known in urban design right now, which is called the urban heat island effect, which basically we can think of it as a bubble of air that is much hotter in a city than in a neighboring countryside 15 kilometers from now, because the material of the city themselves soak up a lot of energy and don't have enough time at night to radiate it back to the sky. It kind of continues bumping in between streets and buildings and canyons, urban canyons that we created, in a way in which over a few days of heat waves, the city becomes much, much, much hotter than the already hotter neighboring countryside. And so we thought if we had to try and do something about this, and a lot of other folks are working on this, obviously, it's not at all only Roofscapes, but we were like, let's start with the metal plates. Let's start with the zinc of Paris, and let's try and see if there are systems that we can put in place to shade these, and at the same time create a new urban experience to basically do green roof gardens on top of historic buildings, so that people have a shared access to green spaces in cities.
So let's go back to your project now that we kind of understand why the zinc is such a hard problem in Paris.
So the way that we did that is that in Paris in Paris, zinc is very important. The work of the folk who works on this zinc roof has been protected in the immaterial UNESCO World Heritage. So it's a really important practice that we know is not going anywhere because it's the soul of the city. At the same time, it's extremely problematic in terms of, I mean, it's creating a lot of problems climatically. So I think what we wanted to do is to try and, rather than say the zinc is bad, how can we work with folks who are doing this to build solutions together? And what we were really surprised and happy to find out is that so many of these folks are ready to find new ways to develop building details in order to accommodate for wooden platforms on top of existing roofs, so that the zinc is preserved, the art that they and the craftsmanship that they have is preserved, but also we prevent those zinc roofs from making up, we cool down the cities, and at the same time we create both places for humans to go on, which is our role as architect, and for non-humans, because we create really resilient ecosystems on roof that allows both humans and non-humans to have kind of a different way to be in urban areas that aren't really something today. And I think in Paris specifically, but also in a lot of European and probably North American cities, roofs are a huge portion of the city. In Paris, it's about 35% of the city's horizontal surface is made of roof, because the city is so dense that you actually realize that streets and courtyards are not so much. Parks in Paris are 3%. So if you start thinking, what can we do with 35%? Which obviously we will never be able to all retrofit in outdoor parks. But I think for us, it was like, what is the most important problem and site of intervention that has had the least innovation? And I think that's really what we tried to tackle.
So as someone, maybe like a developer or an owner of one of these buildings, I have a zinc roof. I want to potentially, protect it. I want it shaded. What is kind of your pitch?
I think what we say is three things. I think it's first, access. You get access to your roof, which you don't have right now. In an extremely dense city, it's something that is the first selling point for a lot of folks, because their willingness to pay really resides on the fact that they can have access to an outdoor space which they wouldn't have. And then the second one is shading, because then the people living on the top floor will not have to suffer the same kind of heat. You will prevent installing air conditioning, which reduces energy bills in the long run, stuff like that. And then the third thing is building a thriving vegetal and ecological ecosystem, which a lot of people feel is something that they want to be a part of. Something that felt important for us as architect was always trying. We did not want the solutions that we built to be something kind of that only the folks in industry would understand. We didn't want to do like some kind of new techie way of like solving heat on roofs. What we really wanted to do is to fold the public in, to sell a narrative that we're like, everyone can have access to this. And if you are able to put down the money or to take a loan to do those renovation projects, well, you're making a significant investment to your existing building, the one in which you live or the one that you own. But that new space that is created on top of the roof is going to provide you double what you invested in it. So we are seeing a lot of willingness to pay from people who have not necessarily deep pockets, but that have cash in hand or that are able to borrow. I think we're still working on finding the right means. And in France, a lot has to do with subsidies to find how we can address the work with I think people who have less means, at least in this moment of their life, and still be able to do that. It's something that we do a lot with social landlords that are publicly funded in Paris. And I think that's generally how the project is understood by the public and our clients.
So how many projects have you done so far?
The first project we did was for the Olympics in Paris. It was a joint venture with the city of Paris on a city-owned building, which used to be a former town hall and now has been rebranded as the Climate Academy. It's basically museums to talk about climate adaptation solutions. And it took a really long time because there are a lot of historic preservation laws in European centers that are protecting folks like us to basically break the aesthetics of the city for a lot of really, really good reasons. And a lot of those administrations that have been put in place in the 60s and the 70s have basically saved the city as we know it today from really rapacious development in the middle of those eras. And so I find it interesting, and it fills us with humility to be now, I think, trying to address the climate question, pushing and nudging rules that are in place right now and that are preventing us from developing climate adaptation as we thought we would want to do it as an architect, but also the same rules that save a lot of what we know of European centers in Europe today.
So there seems to be, I guess, a lot of negotiations, a lot of forces that you're working with. Maybe can you tell us a little bit, maybe for the American listeners who don't really understand what it takes to build in Paris, like what are some of the forces that you have to work with just to get a project built?
So I think the main one that we have to build is to kind of build with is the preservation architect, which for a lot of reasons in France has been kind of removed from the control of cities because there used to be a relatively high level of corruptions in a few French cities if things stayed too local. So the way that this was made is that preservation architects are basically people who decide whether some project can be made or not, depending on how big it impacts the aesthetic of the city and the kind of historic preservation laws that are in place. And this body of experts has been removed and brought all the way back to the government level. And so I think there is an extremely strong will at city scales that the kind of work that we do is happening. And at the same time, France has created an incorruptible body of people who are working really, really far from cities to say, well, we can't allow things that are changing the way that cities look. The problem that we have, I think France as a country, is that it takes, or Europe in general, is that it takes a really long time to change these laws. It will take 7 years for these folks to be able to continue do the work they do in a more climate-minded manner. Because a lot of them are telling us, like, we want to do all we can, but we're literally in place to enforce laws that don't say climate change ever. So we can't really go illegal for you folks. One way that we had to do it is to leave kind of the political sphere of the city itself, but go all the way to the different ministries who all have a bunch of vested interest in the way that French firms and French architects find passive and low-tech solutions that are paid by private money to adapt cities without them to have to do anything. So we had to find a consensus up there to help some of those ministries tell the Ministry of Culture, which holds the preservation, and tell them, well, maybe you should try and give them a little leeway so that they could start. And I think this whole circle was basically what we did from 2023 when we left MIT and the middle of 24 when we started building the joint venture with the city of Paris. It took that long in order to get a permit delivered to do that test.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like in America, we complain about permitting, but you had to go to the national level and get the ministries to convince other ministries in order to get a prototype project built. So I guess like talk to us about the effect of the project. Like, did you guys like measure the heat effect before and after? Like, what was the difference that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, something that was part of the deal with the city of Paris. I mean, I put it in broad stroke. It's not exactly like that, but we had a lot of demands because a lot of folks in Paris were writing to us, and we would keep on filing building permits everywhere, and we would kind of flood the instruction offices with building permits that they had to say no to, and they were like, okay, you folks stop. What we're gonna do is that we're gonna build a prototype together. We're going to measure the heck out of it, and we're going to wait for a full summer, and then we'll reassess. And depending on that, we'll see what future we give to this idea. of climate adaptation of zinc roof in Paris. So we did that. We built it just before the Olympics, and then we had a bunch of heat sensors inside, under the roof, above the roof, in places that were shaded and places that were not, to kind of understand the differences. And we also have had a bunch of fauna and flora inventories that were made before and after to track all sort of metrics. And what happened at the end of that summer is that the data we got was really good, thermally at least. It was too soon to talk about fauna and flora, which often takes a year. Thermally, it was basically saying the zinc roof, without being protected by anything, can go up to the air at the surface of the zinc roof can go up to 65 degrees Celsius, which is a lot. And under it can go up to 44 degrees. And so 44 in the spaces under the roof, and under the prototype that we have deployed, the numbers were much lower. We had a 30 degrees difference above the zinc, and we had a 17 degrees reduction inside under the roof, basically, which was enough for the city to say, okay, this is very fragmented data. It's not a lot. We can't open it all, and it's free for all or whatever. But it's interesting enough that we need to go further. And so the mayor came to inaugurate the building after the Olympics. I mean, the climate intervention that we did, and basically told everyone around, like, let's try and find a few more sites where this could happen. She was kind of opening a little bit the market for us to basically go back to all the clients that we said put on hold, to be like, okay, maybe we in your specific district, because you're far from that church and no one can see you from Tour Eiffel, we can try and do something. And so I think the work that we've done a lot in 2025 now, after the inauguration last November, I mean, one year ago, was basically try to make a practice out of it, one that would actually trying to do our core mission, which is find replicable ways to develop climate interventions in Paris.
So I just want to jump in here, Olivier. It seems like you're solving another problem that could cause issues for the preservationists, which, I mean, if anyone spent a summer in Paris, it's quite hot because you don't have air conditioning. Now, I imagine retrofitting actual AC units, fan coils, and mini splits onto a building would be just as destructive as putting green roofs onto one. So I'm wondering if you're able to sort of judo the argument for potentially adding things on top of the building as opposed to adding things on the side of the building to cool the building. If you're able to sort of make that larger argument, say we get these green roofs instead of having air conditioning, which seems to be more and more inevitable every year in Europe.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a very hot topic. A lot of folks have been talking about this in France during the heat wave that we had. We're not done continuing to address exactly what you said. One of the things that the preservation bodies are saying is that putting AC is also illegal, and so they're like, this is not what you folks are doing is not okay, and putting AC is not okay either. I think what we find interesting to research, and we've actually had people in the team do that for quite a few months now, so I have a pretty big case for it, is to show that it's incredibly easier to install AC illegally by hiding it up there on the roof or behind your balcony with something on it or whatever, than to do the kind of project renovation that we do that don't need AC. So I think, without pointing fingers in all directions, what we're all trying to say is that the situation right now, we cannot just put our hand in the sand and be like, oh, we can't have Roofscapes or other folks do things to the roof because it changes their aesthetic, and everything will just go fine. Because we're seeing, and actually we work a lot with drone pilots and folks like this to try and understand what happens on top of roof, and we're seeing literally the roof of Paris littered with AC in the last few years. Obviously, as I would do as a building owner who's not allowed to do anything else to improve their building. I mean, you're talking about the facades. It's sometimes even hard, even for a city-owned building, to be able to have shading on the facade, because it disrupts the way that the stone facade was built at the time. So if you can't even have that, like, let's talk about a wooden platform on top of a historic building. So I think the way that we're trying to flip this argument upside down is to say climate adaptation or bad adaptation, if we say AC, and good adaptation, if we say shading and vegetation and stuff like that, those kind of adaptation will happen anyway. Because in a lot of places where it's much hotter than it is right now in Europe, people will not wait to know what's allowed and not allowed when it'll be 47 degrees, unfortunately. And so a lot of things will be done, some of them really well, some of them really bad, but I think we will kind of lose track of those interventions because they will go out of the realm of the professional discipline that we're practicing. What we're trying to say is that it's early enough for us and other folks around the table to propose climate adaptation measures that are replicable and that are scalable and all that, and for them to be folded into regulations to be like, okay, what Roofscapes does is, okay, ugly, we don't do it, but this second version is better, and then what these folks do is great, and then what these, so that we can actually give arrows into the quivers of all these folks and be like, rather than saying no to adaptation, let's find the ways in which adaptation is acceptable and is made in a way that is non-destructive to existing building or to the aesthetic of cities.
So it seems like you started cracking that problem. Like from a policy standpoint, you have a prototype, the city is willing to test more, you're starting to develop a practice. Where do you guys go from here?
So we've started building a team recently. Now it's 7 of us at Roofscapes in Paris. I think what's important for us is 2 things. One is to, I think, give much stronger basis to the workflow that we have of being able to actually deliver these projects, because we have demands, but it's not that it's more complicated than we say, but it's like this is the work. We're architect. Every building is different, so there's a level of automation that we can have, but there's still some things that need human verification, and you need building engineers to come on site to check if you can load the building with as much dirt to install the plants and stuff like this. So one thing is just to make sure that we can actually survive as a small practice doing this. That's really I think has been the case in 2025, will be the case in 2026, but who knows later. That's one thing. The second thing is that the zinc roof of Paris is actually only a tiny fraction of this really big puzzle. And this was actually part of a work that we exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale this year, was to say this is only a little bit of what could be done. But we took actually a few building typologies that are ubiquitous in Europe and say, what are ways in which we can adapt these facades and these roofs to climate change in a way that is cheap, that is non-destructive, so you can put them for 50 years and take them out and like you haven't hurt much, that are low-tech, that are passive, meaning they don't require energy, it's just shading, that are bringing plant-based solutions, stuff like that. And so what we are willing to do is that the same way that we tested something on the roof and then are deploying right now a pipeline to develop more of these, is to find different building interventions at different parts of cities and be able to also develop these. So like shading for facades and a whole bunch of other strategies.
That's amazing. I think you've painted a really clear picture for us of like what's the motivation, how you guys took it and looked at practice differently, how you've basically looked at the whole system and figured out where you need to start to make that crack in order to get this prototype through. I think it's a really amazing story. Also, I think you are maybe someone especially good to answer our always last question in our podcast, to help us understand kind of the moment we're in, especially from your perspective, from a sustainability, from a climate perspective, but also from a turning point perspective, how we're going from this world where we're used to, buildings being able to last 50, 100 years to this new world where we're now having to turn over things over and over again. So the question we'd like to pose to you is, if we're 30 years from now, looking back on our world today, what would you say is the era that we're in?
I think we're in an era in which sadly, I think we are starting to, at least recently, in the last few years, recede a little bit on, I think, the kind of green building movement that had a lot of problem because it was probably not monitored properly and calculated properly. I think that there was a lot of greenwashing going there, but I think there was at least an intent of good faith that we were into as a community. And I think the kind of political landscape of 2025 for viewers 30 years from now, now that it's a moment in which a lot of those climate talks are more complicated. I think what it means for us as an industry is that we will, fortunately or unfortunately, we will work on mitigation to climate change a lot less, meaning how can we demolish less so that we produce less carbon by rebuilding? We'll do that less, which is, I think, the core problem, because that's what's aggravating climate change. But fortunately and unfortunately, and I think that also makes us, I think, very humble in what we're trying to do in Paris, climate adaptation will have to happen anyway. So I think what we feel really happy about where we are with Roofscapes and what we're trying to do, but we know that we're working on the part of climate that right now is completely overlooked and will be completely ubiquitous in 20 years. But we have lost a place in which we can actually act on mitigation because we're not part of stopping demolition and rebuilding better. We just work on adaptation. So I think one way that we're trying to fold our work, and I think it will probably take us I think a few years to verbalize it all, is that what we're trying to do with what we do is to find new values for existing build in order for folks to find less incentive to destroy them. If all of a sudden you're in a building in which now you have a suspended balcony that is shaded because we have found a system that we can add it to all facades of modernist buildings. Okay, well now you can live better in that building that used to be relatively strange. So I hope that we manage as an industry to not forget that it's not about only adaptation, and that mitigation really is still the target for
The
ourselves.
mitigation revolution. But that's exciting. We'll have to bring you back to hear more about how some of your new experiments turn out. But if our listeners want to find out more about you, Olivier, more about Roofscape, where should they go?
They can go on our social medias, so Roofscapes Studio on LinkedIn, or on Instagram, roofscapes.studio, and also on our website. They can feel free to reach out. We have an email there that they can find at the bottom of every page, and we'll be happy to chat. A lot of folks actually are writing, and it brings really interesting and oftentimes challenging conversation, which is really wonderful.
Amazing. So you hear that, just, write to Olivier, write to Roofscapes, and tell them all about how excited you are about what they're doing. So thank you, Olivier, for this wonderful conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you, our listeners, for listening to another episode of the Most Modern Podcast.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank to both of you for keeping these conversations alive.